we stand by our results. Not because of arrogance or defensiveness, but we checked everything. Now, the accusations came about as a result of people testing in our lab, going to test elsewhere, and when they tested positive in our lab, I think there's that element of shock, anger, denial. Yeah, so people go elsewhere to test. Now, when they go to test elsewhere and they get a negative result there, then they say our result was false positive, fake. A test can be positive for the same patient at one time, then collected even the same day, even next day, and it can be negative. One of the reasons, as I mentioned earlier, is the way the sample was collected. If the sample was not collected properly, deep at the back of the nose, it might not pick the material. Somebody might actually have the virus, but you did not collect enough material, so it will be negative. If it is red, it means there is a virus detected.
In short, the red one is corona.
It's corona. The blue one is not corona. Negative. And if it is red, si usema machine yetu haijui, haichagui, haibagui, haitambui, haijui nani. So tunasema haijui, haichagui, haibagui, haitambui. Yeye ikisema ni positive, haijui kibida kama ni Lynn ama ni Ed, kama ni positive ni positive.
So in short,
umeona jina mtu hapa?
Hapana.
Hakuna.
Naona tu
numbers. Sasa inaweza kuwa pengine hata ni sample ya nani? Ya minister fulani ama mama fulani, hataki kujua. My name is Dr.Ahmed Kalebi. I'm the founding partner, Chief Executive Officer and Managing Director of Pathology Lancet Kenya. I'm also the Chief Consultant Pathologist. We're a group of labs in East Africa, with Pathology Lancet Kenya being the headquarters, and we're also in Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, and Tanzania.
Can you please explain to us the increase in the number of people who are coming to get tested for COVID-19? And in a day, how many people do you guys receive? On average,
we receive about 600 to 800 at the moment, but it can move anywhere between 350 even up to 1,000. And basically most of the samples we get are submitted samples from other hospitals, laboratories, because we are a referral laboratory. So most of the samples we get come from outside Nairobi, within Nairobi, different hospitals, clinics, and so on. In terms of the actual number of patients who walk into our facility, it can be anywhere between 100 and 300. Most of the people come to us from walk-in patients, as we call them, and we also have the drive-through, people from the public who have been referred by their clinicians. Most of them come because of having positive contacts or having symptoms, one of the two. But for the samples that we get from hospitals and from other laboratories, most of those are based on clinical cases. I think there is an increased number of Kenyans coming for testing because of the increased awareness. It's a global problem everywhere around the world. The numbers of COVID cases are increasing. So what we are seeing is that a lot of people, out of the awareness, want to know their status, number one. But I think most of the cases is because of the positive contacts. A lot of people, you'll find you had a contact with somebody who tested positive, so you want to know your status. Or maybe you're working in a company where somebody tested positive, or in an institution somebody tested positive, and everybody now wants to test themselves. Yeah. Okay. I can say that the symptoms of COVID are very similar to the symptoms of flu and common cold. And this, because this is a virus that affects the airways, so you tend to get things like coughing, snuffling, sneezing, irritation in the throat. But more importantly is the difficulty in breathing and shortness of breath. Those are very dangerous signs because it means that the lung is affected. So the symptoms will depend on where is the virus multiplying the most. If the virus is mainly in the nose, it will be nasal symptoms. It's mainly in the throat, it will be throat symptoms. But if it is in the chest, then it means you get the difficulty in breathing and so on. So there are other symptoms which are not very, very specific, non-specific as we say, body malaise, you're just feeling tired, a bit of humor hapa na pale, fever. These are very non-specific, a bit of headache. But the reality is none of these symptoms is 100% for COVID, which means it could be an indication of something else. And also, there are people who might be completely asymptomatic. In my personal view, based on all the patients we are seeing, I think the most common and useful symptoms of COVID from people I've spoken to is just this feeling that you're not feeling right. Something is just not right. Unasikia ni kama umechoka, mwili, yeah, fatigue. Yeah, but you know fatigue people, mtu anachimba analima, fatigue yake ni tofauti na yako. So when you just feel you're not feeling right, your body is not feeling okay, you want to sleep, you want to rest, and maybe at that time, at the same time, you're feeling a bit of some irritation in your throat or the nose, those are fairly indicative of COVID for most people I've seen. Then there are people who get things like anosmia, which means you can't smell. You lose the sense of smell. This is also quite, it's not as common, but when it's there, it's very, very characteristic. A lot of people who have anosmia, actually everybody who has anosmia who came to test with us, you know, sudden onset anosmia, you've just lost your sense of smell and your sense of taste, because taste depends a lot on smell. Most of those people, when they come to test, they have a very high COVID. Yeah, but I would say the usual things, sore throat, coughing, nasal symptoms, those are the usual symptoms of COVID.
So can you take us through the COVID test? When a Kenyan comes in here, what is that test briefly and how much does it cost?
So the COVID test involves collection of a sample from the nose, the back of the nose. Before we used to collect from the back of the nose and the back of the throat, because those are the two areas where we know there is the highest multiplication of the virus in somebody who is infected. But nowadays we just take from the back of the nose because that has a higher yield, so to speak. So the sample is collected from a swab, and the swab is like an earbud, so but it's a bit longer. So it goes right at the back of the throat. It's not going to the brain upwards, it's actually going downwards to the back of the throat. And there it is, basically when you talk about swabbing, it means you're sort of like rubbing it on the surface, you know, with that, and you're collecting the cells lining the back of the nose or the back of the throat. When that is collected, it is taken to the laboratory. Now, once that is done, we have what we call an extraction process. Now, the extraction process is basically, for people who understand the science, it's called lysis. Basically, you're digesting the cells to release any virus that are within the cells. Now, that's called extraction. So you're extracting material of the virus. And the material of the virus we're talking about here is ribonucleic acid called RNA, and that is what contains the genetic material of the virus. Then after that, now we do what we call PCR. Now, PCR is done on a machine. It's called polymerase chain reaction, and basically what happens is you are multiplying the nucleic acid, the RNA, the genetic material of the virus, millions of times to see if you're able to detect it. So it's a very, very sensitive test. So the material goes into the machine after extraction, and the machine has what we call probes. So these are very specific reagents that bind or react to the virus if it is there. And when it binds to it, it detects and it lights up what we call a fluorescent signal. And we're looking for that fluorescent signal. It's all automated, and the computer shows you whether there's an increase in fluorescent signal, and that shows whether there's presence of the virus or not. Each of these represents a sample, and each one of them also called a well, and they're numbered. And when you look at the computer, this is basically what we are seeing here. So A01, that's a patient, A02, and then we have what we call controls to check that everything is, so like in this case, this is a positive control. And if you look at it, it says here, positive control.
So does this mean the patient is COVID positive?
This one is a positive control. Positive control is a non-positive result. So if it doesn't work, it means something was wrong. Because we expect it to be positive, and here it is positive. So you can see this is one of the genes, E gene, RDRP, N gene, and we have what we call an internal control. This is a negative control, which means it must be negative. Everything must be negative. Because if it was positive, it means there's contamination. So this is C02, C06, which means it was right there. There's an A04, like that. So when you look at this, for us, everything is automated and computerized. So it makes it very easy to interpret. Just by looking at this, I know this is a positive patient. That's a positive patient there. All the red are positive.
All the reds are positive.
Normally, we test for several genes. Some machines test for one gene. Others test for 2 genes. In our lab, we test for 3 genes because the virus has 4 main genes, and I'll mention that for purposes of understanding. There's what we call the E gene, which is the envelope gene. It's like the envelope of the virus. There's the N gene, which is the nuclear gene. It's the nucleocapsid inside the virus. There's the S gene, which is what you see on the surface, those spokes. And then there's the RDRP, which is RNA-dependent ribonucleic acid, the enzyme, the RNase enzyme, that also works for the virus. So all these components are part of the virus. Now each gene can be detected separately. And now the more the genes you detect, the better, of course. So WHO recommends that each machine should be able to at least detect 2 genes. In our laboratory, we detect 3 genes. So if any of these genes are present, these genes are very, very specific to SARS-CoV-2 virus. It means the virus is there. Because if it doesn't detect it, it means there's nothing in that material. But if it is there, it means it's definitely there is representation of the virus. Now, the way we detect it and the way we report it can vary between different laboratories. But ultimately, we say SARS-CoV-2 detected, which means positive, or SARS-CoV-2 not detected. Now, when you say it is not detected, it doesn't mean that the person does not have the virus. Because if, let's say, somebody did not collect the sample properly, I mean, you have seen it on YouTube and other videos, sometimes people don't go into the back of the nose, they just collect it from the tip of the nose. It might not show because you did not collect the right material. When you collect the sample, if the material is there, that is the virus, the PCR will show. And also it depends on which genes are expressed. Yes. Because not all these genes are expressed at the same quantity, at the same amount. So you find that, for example, the E gene tends to be more than the N gene because the envelope is bigger than the nucleus. So there are many, many factors. But the key thing is when we detect the virus through any of the genes, it means it is there. The only time when you can have what we call a false positive result, in other words, the machine says it is positive, but it's actually negative, so it's a false positive, is if there's contamination, because maybe somebody contaminated the sample. But all laboratories will have procedures in place to make sure that they check whether there's contamination, and what we call use of negative control. So there's something you put which is negative, and we take it through the whole process to see if there's any contamination of the negative control, it means there's contamination of the rest of the samples. So there are many checks to do that. Number 2, if let's say there was a mix-up of the sample, but all laboratories have procedures in place to make sure that there's no mix-up of samples. Let's say I had your sample and somebody else, but I mixed them up. So in our laboratory, for example, we use barcodes and other storage numbers to make sure that there's no mix-up. The last time, when the other example, which is the last one, where you can get a false result, is where maybe somebody entered the wrong results when they're entering on the computer. But for example, in our laboratory, the machine is interfaced directly to the computer. So now somebody is not entering it manually. So whatever results comes from the machine, from the PCR machine, goes straight to the computer, and the job of the pathologist or the molecular scientist is basically to sign it out. So there are checks and checks in place to make sure that we avoid any false positive. Now you ask, how much does the test cost? Yes. Now the test is fairly expensive. It's not like your usual test, and PCR tests tend to be fairly expensive because, number 1, the equipment that is used is fairly expensive. It's quite expensive. Number 2, the reagents, more importantly the reagents. Now these reagents, they are what we call probes, as I mentioned earlier, and these probes, basically they are sequenced complementary RNA, or DNA for that matter. Actually it's DNA which is complementary to the RNA so that it can bind to it. Now you remember when SARS-CoV-2 was first announced in early January, the Chinese sequenced it. And when they sequenced it, different manufacturers took the sequences and they made probes out of them. Now those probes are fairly expensive. It costs us about $35 per test for the probe. Then on top of that, then you have other consumables and other things. You know, the PPEs, and that's why these things are fairly expensive. Even you find, even for government which receives its kits on donation, they still charge fairly high because there are other things that go with it. Now, in our laboratory, we charge $8,849 as a standard price. We usually discount to referral laboratories and referral hospitals by about 10 to 20%. But for the walk-ins, that's the price, the standard price, $8,849. When there's a big number of people being tested, for example, for corporate institutions, of course, there is also a discount on that. I think we are the cheapest private laboratory among the top-tier private hospitals that are doing this test. I think the price ranges between $8,849, which we do, to about $11,000 to $12,000 in other private hospitals. In the government, I think they are charging $5,000, although that has been reduced to $3,000, and that is basically to cover the cost of the PPEs and other things that they may be using. Yeah.
So you talked about your lab following all the right procedures, but you are allegedly accused of giving the wrong tests. So can you please tell us, has your laboratory been given the wrong tests?
First of all, I must say that our laboratory is an internationally accredited laboratory, which means that we set up systems in place for quality management systems and quality assurance. We get external bodies that come and review our setups and make sure that all the systems are correct. Now, when these setups are put in place, they are there to make sure that there's robustness and rigorousness in testing. And SARS-CoV-2 is not the first PCR test that we started doing. We have been doing, our lab is now going to its 11th year in October. We have been doing tests for HIV, hepatitis B, hepatitis C, and many, many other things. So when COVID broke out, it was natural for us to set up and start doing the test, and we have the equipment that have been used for other tests that we are also using it. Now, there are certain procedures, protocols in place for quality assurance, and we have those processes in place. And when this allegation started, I remember I called my team, including Dr. Charles Wahome, who is our QA pathologist. I said, guys, we're having these accusations. Of course, you have checked everything in place, quality control, quality assurance, but what's going on? So the guys told me, our quality management systems are right. We stand by our results, not because of arrogance or defensiveness, but we checked everything. Now, the accusations came about as a result of people testing in our lab, going to test elsewhere, and when they tested positive in our lab, I think there's that element of shock, anger, denial. Yeah, so people go elsewhere to test. Now, when they go to test elsewhere and they get a negative result there, then they say our result was false positive, fake. And the first two cases we had, actually, I think both of them were working for a recruitment company for house helps. And one of them went to Nairobi Hospital, the other one went to Cambridge. I think 2 days after, that is 1 day after they got our result, which was 2 days after they had done their test with us, which means they took about 2 to 3 days difference from the time the sample was collected with us and the time the other sample was collected. Now, we went back and checked everything on our side. Everything was in order. The results were authentic, the results were accurate. So we can't explain why the others are negative. All we can explain is that ours is positive. But unfortunately, some media house then really dramatized this and sensationalized it and made us look very, very bad, and we are all over the news, social media and everything. We asked our counterparts in the other facilities to check their results. They checked their results, and they checked their results were negative. We ended up issuing a newsletter to explain why a test can be negative, can be positive today here and negative elsewhere.
Can you take us through that? How
Yes.
can a test be positive
Yes.
here and negative there?
Yes. So a test can be positive for the same patient at one time, then collected even the same day, even next day, and it can be negative. One of the reasons, as I mentioned earlier, is the way the sample was collected. If the sample was not collected properly, deep at the back of the nose, it might not pick the material. Somebody might actually have the virus, but you did not collect enough material, so it will be negative. That's one. Two, even if somebody has the virus, the way the virus is shed is not uniform. You might actually find that early in the morning, there is more shedding of the virus. Of course, if I went and collected the sample, I collected the material. If you come back and collect it later, you might not find enough material. The other reasons are many, including how the sample was handled, because this RNA is very, very sensitive. The way you handle the sample, if you don't handle it properly, then you might end up degrading it and it might be missed. I think you might have heard about the instance of some machines in the US which were giving false negative results in White House. And actually it was an Abbott ID machine, and they were saying that up to 25%, 30% of the cases that were positive in other labs were negative with that machine. And the reason which they gave eventually was that the material, the fluid that was being used was inhibiting, was causing the results, the RNA to dilute. And that led to a false negative result. Now, more importantly is the difference in the machines. And there are studies that have shown that some machines, or rather what we call assays, some assays are more sensitive than others. And the assay that we use is called C-gene allplex. It detects, as I told you, three different viral genes. Other labs, most of the time, test 1 or 2 genes. Now, studies have been shown, including what we call Foundation for Innovation in Diagnostics, FIND, and the WHO. They have actually been able to show that some kits have 100% clinical sensitivity, meaning they pick 100% of the positive cases, while others can have a lower clinical sensitivity. Now, they also show that it has 100% clinical specificity, which means if it says it's positive, it cannot be anything else. Some can have a lower specificity. Now, if you test with a machine that has 100% clinical sensitivity, and then later on the same sample, you test on another machine that has a lower sensitivity, the other machine will fail to detect, and that can end up being said false positive on the one which is actually sensitive, while in reality it's actually false negative. And so I think that's basically what happened here. And most of the studies are showing that the problem between the difference between different machines relates to, especially when you have low levels of viral RNA. Actually, we had an example, one of the first cases, but this did not get to the media, it was scientifically explained. I remember very well we had a patient who was discharged from Bagadi. This patient was supposed to travel, so they came to do a test with us before they traveled. And they had been discharged like a week before. And when they came to do a test with us, it was positive. So I remember this patient raised a lot of noise and said, "You guys are telling me I'm negative, but I had been tested in Bagadi before I was discharged from isolation and I was negative. And you guys are saying I'm positive." We checked everything and it was in order. So we said, most likely you are still shedding the viral RNA. It doesn't mean you are actively infectious, but because our test is so sensitive, even very little amounts, it can end up peaking. And most of the times when we have difference between our lab and other labs, it relates to those people who have a low viral load. And unfortunately, there are many examples. In fact, this morning, one of the senior doctors from one of the leading private hospitals called me this morning and told me they actually have a case who tested positive with us from another hospital, was referred to this hospital, and when they got to that hospital, because the patient was very sick in ICU, that hospital tested twice and it was negative. It was on the third day that the patient unfortunately died, and the sample that was collected that day ended up being positive. It goes to show you that machines can actually miss a positive result, and that's what we call false negative. And that's why WHO says you cannot exclude COVID on the basis of a negative result. You have to repeat several times to exclude it.
So you stand by your team and the results they are giving?
100%. I mean, I can tell you we have had sleepless nights in this place. We've been audited like left, right, and center. Yeah, I mean, the kind of things we have gone through here. I mean, first of all, we take ourselves through the grind and make sure that everything is immaculate. But in addition to that, we have been checked by the Kenya Medical Practitioners and Dentists Board, brought a very high-powered team. It was actually a surprise visit on 23rd of June. Caught us off guard, but we sailed through with flying colors. We had Kenya Medical Laboratory Technologists and Technicians Board who came here on 1st of July, also audited us. They spent the whole day. We had guys from the COVID Command Center, National COVID Command Center. They came here, audited us also in June. We had the National Public Health Laboratory who also came to audit us. We are very confident and satisfied about our results. If there was at all an error, we'll always say there's an error here because there are procedures in place in the laboratory for error to be audited and troubleshot, and then we take what we call root cause analysis and we do corrective action. But we've not had any errors and we are very, very confident with our results. If it is red, it means there is a virus detected.
In short, the red one is corona.
It's corona. The blue one is not corona. Negative. And if it is red, si usema machine yetu haijui, haichagui, haibagui, haitambui, haijui nani. So tunasema haijui, haichagui, haibagui, haitambui. Yeye ikisema ni positive, haijui kibida kama ni Lynn ama ni Ed, kama ni positive ni positive.
So
in fact, umeona jina mtu hapa?
Hapana.
Hakuna. Numbers. Sasa inaweza kuwa pengine hata ni sample ya nani? Ya minister fulani ama mama fulani, hataki kujua.
You raised a very important point. Some people even just, get well,
Yes.
COVID is not a death sentence.
In fact, the majority of people will go by COVID asymptomatically. Right now, the latest data is 2 days, 3 days ago. In Kenya, 92 to 93% of people who have COVID are actually asymptomatic, which means they have no symptoms. Only 7% have symptoms, and the death rate is about 1.6%, less than 2%, which means about 5% are the ones who will be severe, and most of them will come out of it. So most people are actually asymptomatic. They don't even know. In fact, one of the problems we have is people will come and test. In fact, there's one journalist from Mombasa. He said he'll go public with his story. He had come to test with us in Mombasa. And I remember he called me and he really blasted me on the phone. Yeah, but a few weeks later, he called me to thank me because he found he was positive. I mean, we told him he's positive and he didn't believe it. He said, "Mimi niko mzuri kabisa. You guys fake result. I'm going here and there to go and do my test." But when he went and tested at Coast General, he was positive and he was admitted. Most people feel absolutely fine. They have no symptoms whatsoever. Some of the people, maybe they've been told to test because they're traveling. Then they come and they find, oh, I'm actually positive. And they go into denial, shock and denial, as we said. But the point is, you might be asymptomatic. You might not really know you have it until you test. Unfortunately, there is no other way of knowing you have COVID until you do a lab test. Now, the people who are asymptomatic, when they think about it, they'll actually tell you, oh, maybe about 2 days or 5 days ago, I had some fatigue, I had a bit of irritation on my throat. You know, we are not so used to getting mild symptoms. You know, like if you got like a small headache, you might not even tell anybody that you're having a headache. If you feel a bit tired, you might not even tell anybody that there's a problem with you. So most people don't realize they actually had symptoms. And because you recover, by the time you actually come in to do tests, you have recovered from the symptoms, so they are mild. By the time you actually come in to do tests, you're actually positive, but you don't realize that you're actually sick. And that's why it is absolutely important to test and not just depend on that you must have the usual thing of saying coughing and difficulty in breathing. Those are for serious cases. And when I'm saying serious cases, I mean serious in terms of the viral load. You can have a very high viral load, a lot of virus in your body, yeah, in your airways, yet you are completely asymptomatic. Somebody else might have very little amount of virus, but they are symptomatic. It all depends on your immune response and how you react to the virus. But on the other hand, what I'll say is I think COVID has been stigmatized, and too much of a deal has been, big deal has been made out of it. Too much of a big deal has been made out of it. In fact, in my view, people should be more afraid of malaria. Malaria kills, yeah, and it kills badly. A lot of people die from malaria without even getting a chance to know they had malaria, you know. And people tend to ignore malaria. But when you go do a test for malaria, you just say, nataka kupima malaria, unachukua damu, iko vipi, iko positive, unameza dawa. Iko vipi, iko negative. Aya, nitarudi baadaye nipime kama sijasikia vizuri. But people take malaria too casually, yet COVID, which does not kill as much, people take it too seriously. In my view, there shouldn't be that much stigma. Somebody should be able to come and test without too much drama, and when you get your results, go back home without too much drama. We made a big deal out of it such that now we want to be cancelling and all that. We don't need all that. What should be happening is, like the job you guys are doing, let's sensitize people, let's educate people about the dangers of COVID, and also the fact that it's not as dangerous as many other diseases, and it's not a death sentence, so that people can be able to handle it. I think that's my key message is, anybody who has symptoms that could be COVID, those are the guys who are the most infectious, because it has been shown the symptomatic people are the ones who are more infectious than the asymptomatic people. So if you are coughing, if you have a sore throat, if you have all these respiratory symptoms, if you have fever, please go and have your self-tested, because you are more likely than to infect others. And also, by knowing whether you are infected, you can take certain measures in terms of managing yourself, particularly if you get worse clinically. Now, in terms of public health, the usual things people are doing of social distancing, in churches, reduce the number of people, in matatus, separate people, but those have less impact as compared to masks, sanitization, and so on. And of course, now other useful things are like increase your immunity, eat healthy. But those are difficult things to say if you are hustling, yeah? Yes. But I don't think there's anything much that we can do. Let's just hope now that one, we'll get a vaccine soon, which is not going to be very soon. And two, let's hope that there'll be medicines that will work for the severe ill people. But even in countries that have really tried, I just said that Australia recorded the highest cases of COVID for 4 consecutive days in Victoria, Melbourne, and the rest, yet that really had it under control. You look at countries like Spain. I mean, they were ravaged before, they got it right, now it's coming back. I think we are in for the long haul. This thing is going to be with us. Hayendi. And until maybe 60% of the population is infected and recovers, it's not going to go away. But I don't think we can break the transmission completely, but we can prevent the number of people getting infected, and the people who get infected who are severe ill, they can be managed.
They can be managed. Your final words or anything you would like to add?
No, I must say that it has really been tough on us, me and my team at Lancet. All the false accusations and the lack of understanding by the public and even some of the health officials. It's been really stressful. It has taken an emotional toll on my team, because I mean the guys really work hard, and even when we started this whole thing, it's not about the money. I mean, people tend to think, oh, you are doing this thing because you're trying to make the money. No, far from it. We did it because it's our calling. It's the service that we provide. It's just another test that we provide. In fact, one colleague of mine from another lab who have set up COVID called me and told me, hey, I don't know how you guys are managing, because this thing is very expensive. We are hardly breaking even running the test, because these things are actually expensive. But for us, we've been working day and night, sometimes working even 20 hours a day. Sometimes people work 24 hours literally to just try and see that we provide the services. So it's quite painful when you get all these allegations which are unsubstantiated and nobody trying to understand the science. And as a result, we've actually missed the message. You know, the message that should go out to the public there, and this is going to be my final word. The message that should actually go to the public: if you go test for COVID in any laboratory, not only Lancet, if you test positive, go home, isolate, seek medical attention if you have clinical features. Because a positive result is usually a true positive. And if you doubt the result, then go back to the same lab, ask them, can they verify? And once they verify for you, that is it. Now, a negative result, on the other hand, if you still have clinical symptoms or you have had a positive contact, those are the ones now you want to repeat to double check. And once you are negative, it doesn't mean that now you are COVID-free and you have a COVID-free certificate. If you ever get symptoms later, or if you come into contact with somebody else, or you have had a contact with somebody else, then you might want to repeat after a week because of the incubation period of the virus. So it is very important for people to understand this virus. It's a new virus. It's only like 6-7 months old. The more we understand it, the better we can handle it. Just the same way we are handling malaria, we are handling other illnesses like cholera. It's the same thing. I mean, it shouldn't be too much stigmatized, and we should try and make sure that the more we understand it, the better the public can be able to deal with it. And I hope the sad experience we have had and the stressful experience we have had has brought a lot of these things to the fore, because even doctors and healthcare workers, a lot of them were not understanding about the test and about the implications of the results.
Lovely.